Karen and David Swift's marriage ended sometime around 3:30 a.m. on October 30th, 2011. Sadly, it didn't end the way Karen had envisioned it might when she filed for divorce earlier that month from David. But for all intents and purposes, their marriage had been over for a long time. You heard the troubles their relationship had, from David's affair that bore a son, to a divorce, to Karen's affair that caused David to believe that a quick, hasty move to Tennessee would change things, so abrupt that he left his oldest son, Preston, in Arkansas, so abrupt that Karen didn't even see the house that they moved to in Tennessee before they moved into it. But the move only made Karen more independent from David. Her desire to be free from him only grew in Dyersburg. Karen made friends in Dyersburg. David did not. Karen was liked by many people she met in Dyersburg, and you've heard from several of them during the course of the trial. David struggled to fit in, and David's jealousy drove them further apart. His behavior was so bizarre that he was barred from Karen's friends' homes. David's controlling and stalking behavior ultimately led to Karen borrowing money from her friends and filing for divorce. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was the spark that lit the powder keg. For a man who thrived on control, Karen was about to strip that away from him. They were struggling financially as a family. David couldn't afford to maintain the lifestyle he was accustomed to and pay child support and alimony. He wouldn't see his girls as nearly often as he had before. And while those things were important to him, losing control of Karen was the most important to him. Recall the testimony of his obsessive behavior when it came to Karen. Remember the testimony of him hiding in her Murano at Walmart and then confronting Kathy Bona when they returned. Remember how he stalked Amanda MacArthur and Karen when they were just going to Big Lots. Remember how he stalked her at Applebee's while she was just having dinner with Jeannie Garion. Remember how he surprised Janie Helm in her own backyard while he was trying to spy on Karen at the Bonas. And those are just the times we know of. Those are just the times he got caught. But that's the backstory. Let's get down to the murder of Karen Swift. I submit David's preparation to kill Karen started in earnest on August 25th when he twisted his knee, his previously injured knee, at work in Tanaris. He was just standing there and he flopped into the arms of a coworker. That was his first manifestation of his intent to kill Karen. He would very publicly hobble around on crutches and pretend to be injured so people would think that there was no way that he could kill his wife. But what do we know about his claim of being disabled? Well, let's first go to the 29th. You recall Mr. Terry Harris talking about how David could drag 60-pound hay bales with no trouble. Carrie Smith, his physical therapist, told you there's a big difference in being able to carry something and being able to drag it. You also heard Carrie Smith tell you that he began a physical therapy regimen with David on November 16th, just weeks after Karen's murder. Mr. Smith knew better than anyone of David's physical capabilities at the time of the murder, and he stated without reservation that in his professional opinion, David was capable of dragging Karen's lifeless body out of the house, into a vehicle, and down into the kudzu at Bledsoe Cemetery. Let's continue with the morning of the 29th. Remember, David goes to the skating rink and has that bizarre conversation with a woman he didn't even know. Later that day, David takes Keeley to the mall and encounters Janie Helm again. He tells her this was the same Janie Helm who told him to stay out of her backyard, the same Janie Helm who witnessed him driving up and down the road in front of the Bona's house whenever she would be visiting them. David told Janie about Karen's rebuff of his romantic invitation to a reconciliation dinner that night. He even asked if he could go back in her yard that night and spy on Karen again. As one might imagine, she again told him no. That dinner invitation rebuff was also recounted to you by Jason Creasy, Miss Swift's attorney. I submit that rejection that night was the straw that broke the camel's back, ladies and gentlemen. David goes home from the mall and he stews. He's sitting there with Keeley. Rejection eats at him while Karen is out partying with the Bonas and the Lees. And it finally sinks into him that night. Karen is really leaving him, and this time it's forever. After the party, the Bonas go with Karen and they get some fries and they head back to her house. Karen planned to spend the night with the Bonas that night, but you could tell by the text that I provided to you that David sent Karen that he didn't know that. He texted her around 10. When were you coming home? Go in the side door. The garage door's closed. Keely's in bed with me. Karen and the Bonas hadn't been at the Bonas long when Ashley, who had been at a sleepover, texted Karen. She wanted Karen to pick her up and come home. And of course, that's what Karen immediately did. Now, David's versions of events, what happened that night, varied. We know it was 2:08 a.m. because that's when Karen's iPhone connected to the network extender at the Swift home. But David's story generally was that he talked to Karen and Ashley briefly, and then he went back to bed and slept until 10 o'clock the next morning when he discovered that Karen and her Murano were missing. But what was he really doing while he claimed to be asleep? We know from Special Agent Wade that he was awake because he was active on his computer from around 2:45 to 3:30. And what's he doing on his computer during that time? Well, we know he's accessing photos of Karen's tattoo. And I submit he's also accessing a device of Karen's, because what are the chances David's going to have 25 plus pictures of Karen's landscaping jobs on his phone? I submit David was sitting up in his room getting angrier and angrier at the woman who rejected him. He's sitting in his room until his anger boils over and he decides to end his humiliation and end his marriage. But again, not in the way Karen had envisioned. I have to be candid. It is impossible to tell you the exact manner or mechanism of Karen's death. You heard Dr. Ross, the medical examiner, state to many questions the body was simply too decomposed to tell. I submit to you, though, that given the physical evidence that we have, it is likely that David strangled Karen, dragged her body to the garage, and ended her life, if she wasn't already dead, with a blow to the head. However, to prove David killed Karen, the state is not required to prove the exact means of Karen's death beyond a reasonable doubt. What we are required to prove is who killed Karen beyond a reasonable doubt. Who, not how, is the decision you will have to make here. Now go back to David is up in his room. He's formulating his plan. He knows Ashley's a problem for his plans for Karen because she's in bed with Karen. He can't risk waking Ashley. So he goes down, he picks her up, and puts her in Keely's room next door. And then he goes back to Karen. He had to get control of her somehow. I submit that he strangled her because her nails were not broken. There was no DNA, under her fingernails. Those are classic signs of a victim that didn't struggle. What is important that Karen, he then drags her to the garage. With Karen's head lying on the concrete floor, he administers a powerful blow to her head. The exact object cannot be known, according to the medical examiner, Dr. Ross. And I submit, ultimately, it's unimportant for our consideration here today. What is important is that she did receive a blow so powerful that it fractured the right side of her skull into pieces, sending chips of bone into her brain. The left side of her brain experienced less severe fracturing, consistent with being held against a solid object, such as a garage floor. The opposing forces that were administered to her head caused the natural sutures in her head that were hardened when she was a child to come apart. Whatever state she was in entering the garage, that blow to the head ended her life. Dr. Ross testified that this wound could have been a closed head wound, which means no blood, or maybe very little blood. I submit there might have been some blood because all the bleach bottles in the backyard. Late October is not the time to clean a pool. And I submit from the photo of the pool and evidence behind the bleach bottles, that pool hadn't been attended to for quite some time. Now Karen is dead, and David is faced with a dilemma, what to do with her body. First, he has to worry about Ashley waking up. Remember, Keely's still upstairs in his bed. Either one wakes up alone, and he's caught. So he moves Keely from his bed to downstairs with Ashley, where where he had moved her previously. That way, if either girl wakes up, they will have the other one and hopefully go back to sleep. David loads Karen's body into either her Murano or his Volvo, drives the 6 minutes to the cross, and drags her into a depression. Now, he's in a hurry, so he doesn't have a lot of time to cover her body up, so he drags her into a little dip, and he hopes that that is sufficient enough for her not to be seen by anybody who was driving or walking by. And it worked. She wasn't found for 40 days. The distance that he had to drag her from that road, and you see it in the picture there, it's not a formal paved road, but it's a path that's obviously traveled a lot by cars, was only about 20 feet, the testimony showed. I submit that the picture of Karen's body in her underpants completely support that she was dragged. Normally, when underpants are worn, they are up around the hips. Karen's was down. You could imagine that somebody dragging a body, the underpants would naturally scrape across the earth and have them pulled down somewhat. I submit that if you look at that gruesome photo of the body that's submitted into evidence, you will see that that is what happened to her underpants. Now that his task is accomplished, David heads back. He has more work to do. The cover-up. He's got to make it look like she just took off in the middle of the night. So he gets an idea. I'll make it look like she had a flat. Drive her car down the road and leave it like she abandoned it after getting a flat tire. So he takes an item that's in every garage in America almost, a screw and a screwdriver, and he inserts the screw into her tire. But what he didn't count on was that the screw wouldn't have caused the tire to go flat immediately. So he's forced to deflate it. And he does that by manually depressing the stem. He goes back to the house and collects Karen's iPhone. The phone goes off the network extender at 4:38, and down the road he goes. This is consistent with what Miss Mary McWhorters told you she heard and when she heard it. The defense will have you believe that her phone did not go off the network extender until 5:09. Their expert testified, don't believe Verizon and their records, believe me. What makes his testimony so unbelievable is he'd have you believe that at 5:09, she left the house and immediately turned off her phone. But what's interesting is that he really didn't have an answer for, at 5:09, that exact moment she left the house, her iPhone quit accepting data forever. Think about it. How likely is it that you're leaving your house to meet someone, and the second you walk out of your door, you turn your phone off? It just doesn't follow. But let's go back to what really happened. There are two flaws in David's plan he didn't count on. First, driving a car on a flat tire is noisy. So much so that he woke his neighbor, Mary McWhorters. Second, it most likely didn't occur to him before he started out on his journey that he couldn't just drive her car to some far-off place. He'd have to walk back. And walking back on the side of the road at that time of night, when only people who were walking that's not of their own choosing would be on the road. He would draw attention if somebody drove down the road and saw him walking. So he leaves the car at the first intersection, Harness and Millsfield. Mr. Bolden and the defense's tire experts testified that the front tire that was flat showed extensive run-flat damage, consistent with being driven on while flat for a good distance. At the highway, David makes another mistake. David's tall. Karen was short. He forgot to move the seat back forward when he got out. You heard Deputy Alexander testify that he's 6'2", and when he got in the car, he didn't have to move the seat back. It's an understandable mistake. David had a lot on his mind at that time. So he gets out of the car and begins the short walk home. 5 minutes at a leisurely pace. Then he remembers he still has Karen's phone. He can't take it back in the house because the network extender will register that. So he stomps it into what you see in the pictures and tosses it in the brush off the abandoned driveway on Harness, which is on his way back home. I submit to you that the iPhone is critical in this case because logic will tell you that the person that smashed Karen's iPhone also smashed Karen. Agent Rexon testified that before it was destroyed, the iPhone was somewhere on the wide arc she just showed you in the pictures. She also told you the tower connections that she read in the RTT reports showed that the phone was most likely in that bottom arc away from the Mississippi River, and the bottom part of the arc, which is where Karen's body was disposed of, where the Swift home was, where the phones were discovered, and where the car was abandoned. So common sense and simple math tell us that it was on the far right side of the arc, because Marty Lamb and Jimmy Martin both testified that they saw Karen's vehicle at 5:15, just 6 minutes after the iPhone was destroyed. So when was Karen's iPhone smashed and tossed in the weeds? Again, that's something I can't give you an exact answer to. The phone was found, we know the phone had its last contact with Verizon at 5:09. It was found by Trooper Page 145 feet off Harness Road in the woods. That driveway that led into that was only 578 feet from the Swift home, and directly on the path David would have taken going home. And because it was destroyed, that iPhone no longer connected to the network extender or to Verizon's towers. The twist about Karen's phones is this. Remember, the iPhone was found right beside the Voyager phone. What was the last activity of the Voyager phone? Agent Wade testified to you that at 9:55 that morning, it called voicemail. That's 5 hours after almost 5 hours after Karen's iPhone was destroyed. Agent Wade told you that call does not appear on the Voyager's Verizon records. And Agent Rexing and Agent Wade both told you that the reason why a phone call would appear in an extraction but not on the Verizon records is that call was being routed through another type of network, such as a network extender. Ladies and gentlemen, that Voyager phone called voicemail at 9:55 on October 30th from the Swift home. The compelling fact of this is that the phones were found together. The person who dialed voicemail at 9:55 in the Swift home was the same person who destroyed Karen's iPhone. How else could they get in the woods together? Whoever discarded the Voyager phone had to have known where that iPhone was. But when did he do it? Again, we cannot know. He might have tossed the iPhone on the way back from the Murano. Makes sense that Karen would try to hide the phone that she was concealing from David somewhere in her room, in a drawer under her mattress. David had plenty of time to get back and search her room and find it before the girls got up around 10. You saw the pictures of her room. It was ransacked. Not like David was hesitant at all to snoop in Karen's room. Remember the story he so unnecessarily happily relayed to both sets of detectives who interviewed him about the glass object he found in her coat pocket? And if there's any question in your mind about David possessing that Voyager phone, remember David telling officers in that first interview, almost right off the bat, that he had confronted Jamie Gurian the night before, which was October 30th, the day Karen went missing, that he had confronted Jamie because he had discovered Jamie and Karen had been talking. Agent Wade told you the only calls between Jamie and Karen were on that Voyager phone, the phone David professed not to know she had. So David calls Jamie Gurian on the night she went missing and inquires to him about calls made on a phone he claims to not know of. David pretends to sleep, or he does whatever he's doing. We know there is some period of computer activity again that morning, and the girls wake around 10. He acts surprised when they tell him their mom isn't home. He calls Karen's phone, sends a few texts, pretending not to know where she is. He keeps this up until Jenny Lamb tells him Karen's car's on the highway around 2 that afternoon. By this time, her friends, the Bonas, are getting a little freaked out. They can't get a hold of Karen. After Kathy talks to David, Bill Bona reports her as a missing person to the Dyer County Sheriff's Office. Brandon Alexander, who's now with the Dyersburg Police, is first to respond. He finds the vehicle secure, doors locked, windows up. David brings a spare key to the scene, and Alexander checks the vehicle for signs of foul play. This is when he sits in the Murano's driver's seat without having to move it. Nothing seems amiss. So Alexander, once Sergeant Walker gets on scene, he goes off to take other calls. Sergeant Walker calls his higher-ups, such as Chief Investigator McCright, and asks permission to have the car towed at that point. He knows that it's important to preserve any evidence that might be found in the vehicle. Sergeant Walker asks David if he can do a walkthrough at the house and see if there are signs of an obvious struggle. Seeing none, he leaves. He comes back later with Deputy Petrie, and they are talking to David out in the front yard. Their testimony was that David was more than excited to share his experience as a reserve deputy sheriff in Arkansas, but when they asked him direct questions about Karen, he lowered his head and searched for answers. The next morning, it's October 31st, it's Monday morning. Chief Investigator McCright assembles other investigators from the Sheriff's Office along with TBI agent Nathan Bishop to formulate a plan to search for Karen. Exigent circumstance requests are sent to Verizon and search parties are planned. But first, Chief Investigator McCright wants more experienced deputies or more experienced investigators to interview David to dig a little deeper. So David comes to the office, and right off the bat, he starts telling investigators that just yesterday he discovered that Karen had another phone that the bonus gave her. He tells them about confronting Jamie Gurian the previous evening. And I've already reminded you that Karen's Verizon phones, the phone that David, remember, was showing Deputy Alexander. He brought Deputy Alexander into Karen's room, and he brought up her Verizon account and was showing him her records. There were no calls to Jamie Gurian on that phone. The only way David could have known that she and Jamie Gurian had talked was if he had possession of that Voyager phone and was scrolling through the call log. Now, Jamie testified that he didn't remember the calls, but the records are the records. And it's not that just that David lied about the Voyager phone. It's why he lied, because he had to. When he was being interviewed by those investigators, he knew that Voyager phone was lying in the weeds right beside that iPhone in the woods. It'd be pretty hard to explain how he knew the contents of a phone that he was claiming he didn't know existed. He goes on to tell the investigators of his version of talking to Janie Helm at the mall that night. He tells the investigators, she told him, "You got to come in my backyard to see what's really going on." You heard Janie Helm testify. Do you think she really invited David into her backyard? Pretty much the rest of the interviews are David nonstop Karen bashing, not so subtly telling the investigators Karen was a drunk, a serial adulterer. The implication being with somebody who's that wild and careless, anything could have happened to her. David's self-serving interviews aside, let's focus on the night in question. Because for someone other than David Swift to have killed Karen, there are several things you must believe have occurred. First, Karen must have had plans to meet someone that night. No one just leaves the house at 4:30 on a Sunday morning to aimlessly drive around. You heard Agent Wade. Her last text from a romantic interest ended with, "Call me sometime. I'd love to take you to dinner." Second, Karen would have had to have moved both Ashley and Keeley to the other bedroom. Does that make sense? Remember, David texted Karen and said, "Keeley's in bed with me." She was 5. This was the middle of the night. Karen would have never gone into David's bedroom to move Keeley. It just doesn't make sense. She was trying to sneak out, as the defense claims. Why would she risk waking not one, but 2 sleeping children and alerting David by going into his bedroom? It simply doesn't make sense, ladies and gentlemen. Think about the timing of it as well. What had Karen done on the day of the 29th? She spent her day cleaning a filthy Habitat for Humanity home in Trimble. She had gone to a party where she had some drinks. Kathy Bona said she was drinking margaritas. She picks up Ashley and arrives home. We can surmise by the toxicology report and the bottle of PM cold medicine and a half-empty water bottle by her bed, she took a Benadryl and went to sleep. Benadryl on top of alcohol, what did Dr. Ross say about that? greatly enhanced sedative effects. Karen, after all of that, the defense will have you believe, gets up to meet someone on 2.5 hours of sleep. Remember the last text from the Voyager phone that she received. Call me sometime. I'd love to take you out to dinner. That's hardly, hey, let's meet at 5 o'clock in the morning. Mary Claire Hopper testified that Karen was expected to be cleaning the Trimble house again that Sunday. Karen needed that money. She would have never missed an opportunity to earn cash to get away from David. Next, let's talk about the tire in depth. The defense will have you believe that the Murano ran over the screw heading to Millsfield Highway. Let's break down the opinions of the experts. First, they both agree there was no manufacturing or design defects in the tire. Second, they both agree the tire was severely damaged from operating while flat. Third, they partially agree with the conclusion of their expert partially agrees with Mr. Bolden's conclusion that the loss of air was from the screw. Mr. Darr said it could have come from the valve stem. Mr. Bolden's response to that, when I asked him, he said, "Of course it could have come from the valve stem. I was only hired to examine damage to the tire." Lastly, and most important, the defense's expert asserts the screw could have been inserted perpendicularly through natural acts of driving down the road. First thing to note about this opinion, and it's a big note, they claimed the tire was not available for inspection, so they could only examine photographs they described in their report as having poor resolution. Chief McCright testified, and it was unrebutted by the defense, that no one ever asked to examine that tire. So Quality Forensic Engineering made a decision to offer you a report on a tire they never physically inspected and claimed it was because it was not available. That being said, let's turn our attention to the conclusions they reached. They stated that they had tested thousands of tires over the years, and many, I quote, many screws and nails had been seen to enter the tested tire perpendicularly. They continued to say it was, and again I quote, unlikely that they were all manually inserted, and it is plausible a screw could be inserted perpendicularly through normal driving. That's essentially saying anything is possible. I asked Mr. Darr if he had any diagrams or illustrations that could explain to us mathematically how that could occur, and he did not. Mr. Bolden's next conclusion about that entering perpendicular is also compelling, because he told you that he knew that it was manually inserted because the head of the screw was below the tire tread. Quality asserts, oh, hold on. The tire could have, after having driven over that screw perpendicularly, as Mr. Bolden said, a stars aligning moment, that it also could have driven over a pebble of precise size, can't be too big or it'll hit the treads. It has to be the precise size and has to hit that screw head exactly right to drive it up underneath the treads. That's the second star aligning event that the defense says happened in a quarter mile. Next, Quality took issue with Mr. Bolden's assertion that because he did not see localized tearing on the inside tire liner, that supported his conclusion that it was inserted manually. The defense expert, Mr. Darr, instead of testing a similar inflated tire, he takes a similar tire, doesn't inflate it, sticks wooden blocks in it, and then he hammers screws into the tire and puts his drill into the tire and claims that this was a comparable examination. Have you ever heard the term comparing apples to oranges? I submit Quality's Engineering's report is just that. But let's continue with the defense's theory of Karen's death. So she snuck out. Her car runs over a screw, then runs over a rock, which wedges the screw deeper in the tire. It deflates. She continues to drive, causing the run flat damage. Now she's on Millsfield Highway. We know she left the house at 4:38. That is consistent with what Mary McWhorters heard going down the road at that time. She stops at the intersection. What do we know about the Murano? You saw the pictures of the back. The jack had not been attempted to be accessed. We know from her phone records, both Verizon and the Voyager, the iPhone and the Voyager records, She didn't phone a friend. She didn't call AAA. So what's the only other option she could have been, the only option she was faced with? Her only alternative was to walk home. You heard one of her friends testify Karen was in such good shape she could have made a quarter-mile walk in 3 minutes. So she starts walking back. And her phone, we know, stopped connecting towers at 5:09 when it was presumably destroyed. The defense will have you believe that John Hogshooter, just like Mary McQuarters, was woken up by Karen's flat tire going down the road. And in those few minutes after he was woken up, that he walked or drove down to where Karen was at Millsfield Highway and instantly formed the intent to abduct and kill her. A woman he didn't even know. John Hogshooter, who'd spent the entire weekend at church-related events, really had murder in his heart. That's what the defense will have you believe. And think about this. How would John Hogshooter would have been able to creep up on Karen while she was walking home and kill her? Where would he have taken her? His wife was home. There were no defensive wounds. Remember, her fingernails were intact. There was no DNA under her fingernails. Karen was described as a feisty woman. She'd have fought John Hogshooter if he tried to grab her on that road. The defense will have you believe that Hogshooter was able to get her off the road before 5:15 when Marty Lamb and Jimmy Martin saw her vehicle. Ladies and gentlemen, your charge is one of reasonable doubt. I submit the defense's John Hogshooter theory is anything but reasonable. I submit that the state has shown you reasonable doubt, or showed beyond a reasonable doubt, that only one person on the planet had the motive, the means, and most importantly, the opportunity to kill Karen Swift. I submit that David's self-reported knee injury and hobbling around on crutches and a brace was proof that he was formulating a plan to kill Karen and used his supposed disability as a defense. It's hard to remember you're supposed to be hurt when you're really not. From hay bales to jumping off on a four-wheeler, you've heard several witnesses testify that his claim of injury was at best exaggerated. Kerry Smith is a man who testified to you, and as a physical therapist, his whole professional life was devoted to testing people's and their physical capabilities due to injuries and rehabbing those injuries. Mr. Smith told you without hesitation that David Swift on October 30th was capable of dragging Karen's 125-pound lifeless body. This case is about one thing: identity. Who killed Karen Swift? Given all that you heard, I'm confident you will come to the conclusion there's only one person in the planet that could have killed Karen Swift, and it was David. David was content with the status quo at 65 Willie Johnson Road. He was happy. He was fine with being in a marriage that was a marriage in name only. Karen was not, and David killed her for it.
Mr. Taylor? Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning. I believe the judge is going to enforce these time standards, so let me get to the point. Let me start out by thanking each of you. Can y'all hear me? I'll use my outside voice. For your service. This has been a long trial. It's been a long trial for those of us who do this sometimes, and we appreciate your patience with me, our questions. I told you it was going to be a fight. Justice is only served if there's a fight through questions, and through this struggle, you decide. I also would like to say to Mr. Goodman and Mr. Box, we have been passionate in this case, and I commend you, and you've tried to do your job, and I've tried to do my job as professionals. Thank you, Judge, too, for your patience and sustainments. In this case, Karen and David Swift were married for a number of years. They were happy. They had 2 boys. They had a divorce. They had problems. They got back together. They had 2 daughters. They're in Dyersburg. David's working, Karen's doing her activities, David's working a lot, he's raising his family. As time moves into 2011, Karen Swift changed, and it's just a fact. And I'm not trying to trash her or trash David, but they grew apart. Other people got involved with activities that made him uncomfortable and some of her friends uncomfortable, that they backed away from her. And they talked about how they did things as families, and then it changed. We talked earlier about when you're in a relationship and somebody you believe is not being honest with you, sometimes you want to find out. You check on them, you ask them questions, and sometimes that happens. There's no violence. There may be questions, accountability. Hey, where are you going? It may get on the other one's nerves, but if somebody says they're going to go to Walmart and go shopping, and then in nighttime, and then it seems out of the ordinary, and then you go and they're not there, a lot of people in a relationship might want to know. There was no hitting, struggling. It was asking questions. And she didn't like it, and I guess Ms. Bona didn't, because they wanted to change. I mean, they wanted to do what they wanted to. But Karen Swift was not afraid of David Swift. You heard about another issue where she's parked at the mall, and they see his car. Karen Swift asked the lady with her to flash the lights, and David Swift came over and they had a conversation. She wasn't afraid of him at all. She was a strong lady physically, and the prosecutors talk about control. They talk about him trying to control her, but really, did David Swift control her? She had another phone supplied by another couple. She went where she wanted to go. She had joint access to their bank account. And so did he really have control? Because she went where she went, she did the behavior she wanted to, and that's just a reality. And as we move on closer to the time she got a divorce, she would come and go as she wished. Now, he might ask her questions. He might say, where are you going? He would go check on her, but there was no violence. She didn't like it. It got on her nerves. It got on her friends' nerves that she would be with at a party or what she was doing, but there was no violence. When she filed for divorce, she took the two girls, she filed. You heard from the lawyer. It was a contested divorce, and the grounds she filed for were irreconcilable differences and inappropriate conduct, not cruel and inhumane treatment, not physical violence. She went to her trip. David got informed by her. I submit that she came back. She came to the house. She stayed at the house. She wasn't afraid of him. Did David think maybe they could work it out again like they did the first time? Was he hopeful about that? Yes, I submit. In opening, the prosecutor said that David didn't even get an attorney. He said that. We know that through the divorce attorney that the state called that David did get an attorney. Attorneys don't come free, and he had to respond. And he was possibly trying to work it out, but protect himself. He wanted to see his girls. He didn't want to have custody, the majority, away from him. And yes, he was concerned about finances. And she had access to their finances. And the testimony that she cleaned his bank account out when she went to Alabama. He shared his money with her while she comes back home. They're in the home. They're trying to at least talk and work it out, and this goes on. Now, in a divorce, when you have grounds, The lawyers encourage, I submit from their witness, to kind of check up, see what's going on, because those things do matter. And we go on through the time in October. David injures himself. Mr. Summerfield doesn't have a dog in this fight. He wasn't a best friend of David Swift, the gentleman that he worked with that saw him injure himself. He doesn't have a dog in this fight. And he recalls that David Swift, the week before, looked down and depressed. If you care about somebody and it's not working out, you could be down and depressed. And even if you don't get along with them, you still may care about them, and even if you don't understand them. But Mr. Summerfield doesn't have any reason to lie. He told you that. And he knew that David Swift had been injured before, and a re-injury. The prosecutor would argue that this is a complete fake. He's already thinking about this. This is premeditation. Think about all the people that saw him with the immobilizer on his leg after that. Think about all the people that saw him with the crutches. You know, from some of these witnesses, when you deal with credibility of witnesses, we had a lot of witnesses in the state's proof that saw him with crutches and verified that he appeared to have a leg injury, a knee injury. When you ask questions of witnesses, you have to decide, too, some things. If one side asks questions of a witness, the prosecution, and they seem to understand all the questions and volunteer the information, and when the other side asks questions, well, what do you mean? I don't remember that, and you have to pull it out of them. It seems like they have an attitude or a bias, and you have to kind of decide if that gives weight to their testimony. And I'm just saying that's a reality. You'll have an instruction about witnesses, and you can disregard or take into consideration different parts of their testimony. We went through a lot of transcripts where when the prosecutors called them, they said something different. They said something a lot milder than what really happened. So you heard all that. I'm not going to go back through it all. And so you have to decide that in credibility. Now, we go on to around this time frame. David Swift's at home. His kids are at home. He's working. We got things going on in the neighborhood. We had issues with the dog killer. The neighbors, the Nafis, had that issue. They testified about the strangeness going on over there. From the officer, you heard about Mr. Hogshooter, and some of the issues over there with the dogs. And the Nafis told you that they lived next to David Swift, and you know that both of their dogs were injured. There's some strange things going on. Those are things you have to take in consideration. Now, in order to get to the point, as we move on into closer to this time frame, she's missing on that Sunday morning. David Swift talked to the police immediately. He agreed, and you saw the long interview the first day. He answered all their questions. I didn't do anything. They say it's self-serving. They're the ones that played it. And they say that he talks on, and people with domestic situations talk sometimes both sides about, well, let me make you understand why I'm okay, but they're doing wrong. And sometimes that's going on both sides. And he talks to them, he cooperates, he answers all their questions. Now, when she ends up missing, you remember the lady that testified, Miss Lamb, that David called looking to see that Sunday morning where she is? And she said he seemed genuinely surprised when she said her car is sitting up on Millsville Road with looks like it's flat, something wrong with it. The state said that Miss Bona called David, but David called her. He's looking. He goes, you hear from his daughter that testified what she remembered. She goes to the car. They go, he takes the girls to Miss Lamb to be watched while he goes look. He goes to the car. He stops. He gets out. He checks on it. And then he gets back in the car and takes them to Miss Lamb. She watches them. He comes back. The Bonas are there. And then the officer arrives. Now, the Bonas said a little different things about this. And they're really involved in her life. They've got her, the Voyager phone records. They're watching what she's doing. They're paying her for the divorce. And I don't know, you have to take, I guess, their attitude or possible bias into consideration. David comes back. He cooperates. They look in the car. There's nothing in the car indicating something happened. David comes back. The officer takes him down to his house. They walk in through the garage. The officer doesn't smell or see anything out of the ordinary. He goes in the house. The officer looks at wherever he wants to go, and David allows him to. The officer sees a uniform and strikes up a conversation and implies that he's a human lie detector. And if somebody looks down when you say, well, some things about your wife, well, it's kind of depressing. It is kind of depressing if you're having problems, or if she's gone and you don't know where she is and her car's sitting out there. There's an emotional thing going on with him. You can't read somebody's mind. So you should consider these things. Anyway, David cooperates. They come to his house. They walk through his house. They look anything in his house. The prosecution says that he grabbed her out of the room and that she was under the influence. The medical examiner, when I asked him questions about that, she had these things in her system. He could not say what levels they were or what effect, because he didn't do that. He just sent them off to another lab. He couldn't say what effect or what levels. And if you recall, he couldn't say whether she took them that night or the night before. 24 hours. Remember what he said. And we know that she was going to get up and go back to Trimble. I don't know what her other plans were. The things on the phone or the camera, she just came from a party at the country club. She's there dressed up in her outfit with her friends. It's logical she would be bringing either a camera or have her phone with her. It's logical that Karen Swift would want to either her pictures, download those. So, and it's logical also that if she had her iPhone, if she's got a passcode, the 4-digit thing, you heard the testimony from Miss Bona that she was always changing her passwords and security things. How would he know? How would David Swift know? Now, the Voyager phone, there was a contact saved in David Swift's phone where that number had contacted him before. It said Billy Bona, the son of the Bonas. You saw in some of the messages yesterday where Karen texted saying, if my husband calls you and I called this number by mistake on my iPhone, it's my husband, and implying just act like you don't know what we're doing. That Voyager phone, earlier, Karen, I submit, had used from, and maybe Billy Bona had it, but that's the contact ID that David Swift had in his phone around the Alabama trip. And so is she calling if her phone got cut off, if her bill wasn't paid by her, and she temporarily called from another phone? She's doing it with her iPhone. She's forgetting who she's calling, and that is only logical. Now, David, when he talked to the police, said apparently she's got a second phone that she's using all the time, but you recall what you heard from the tape. The state is saying that David Swift grabbed her out of her bedroom, tore her clothes off in that room. Nobody heard that in this house that was there, who was there. The clothes that they're talking about is not, they weren't found there or anywhere. There's no evidence of a struggle in that room. You heard her daughter, who was there, and their son, who came the next morning. It didn't look out of the ordinary. You can look at those pictures over there about the nightstand. Nothing's in disarray. Is it an untidy place? There was a headboard and everything was tested. There's nothing indicated that anything occurred in that room, I submit. The prosecutor is saying to you that he took her out in the garage with a knee injury on his left leg and stomped her head in the garage. If he has a knee injury, you can maybe think, is it possible that he could stomp her head? He's not going to do it with his injured leg, I would think. And is it possible that if he's going to use his right leg, that he can put enough pressure on his injured leg and stomp her head in, and she's just going to sit there and take it, a strong woman? There's no physical evidence in the garage. There's no blood in the garage. They imply that later they went out there and there's a picture showing bleach near a pool. This is October. Pools get closed. Bleach is used for pools. You heard Mr. Swift, Mr. Dustin Swift, testify about what their practice was about how they cleaned it. There's nothing in the pool that indicates that it was. We don't know anything about the inside of the pool because they didn't look. You got some bleach out near the pool or in some trash cans behind the pool, next to the pool. They had the opportunity to swab and test all these things because we know that the TBI, through Nathan Bishop, did a very thorough examination where they swabbed and took pictures and stains and fibers in the house, and there's nothing indicating it. They say he cleaned up in the garage, but if he cleaned up, they did find not human blood. They conclusively said it's not human blood. So if it's animal blood, I submit dog blood. Is that consistent with the dog being in there? Or the blood wouldn't even be in there, or would be so degraded that you couldn't even tell. You could see a presence of blood without making a conclusion that it's an animal. None of the things in the house verify anything that the state says about their theory of the case. David Swift had no marks or cut or bruises on him. He completely cooperated. He went the next days and the days following, and if they wanted to interview him, he sat and talked to them. And so you need to consider all this. The tires. We heard from two different individuals, Mr. Bolden. Mr. Bolden indicated, and he was honest about it, his opinion is based on the screw being in at an angle. He just doesn't believe that it could have happened on road conditions. But when asked, he says, it could happen, I don't think it did, but everything, the stars and the moons would have to line up for it to happen. Is that enough? Is that enough? When he made his opinion, he said, I had another case that involved this, and we did find a mechanism, an error mechanism to do this, that I could make that conclusion that that happened. There's no hammer, there's no screwdriver, there's no mechanism, there's nothing from David's house indicating that that happened. The screw is a rusty screw on the inside. There's no evidence taken from his house or garage that he even had any screws that were similar to that. Isn't that something that you would want to consider to have the presence of mind for your mind to rest easy, there's nothing. There's no, so you have Mr. Bolden saying that, and you have my tire expert, and he has extensive experience. He recreated an exact tire to do the testing and his conclusions. But Mr. Bolden admits that. The screw looks like it's old. It could have been picked up on the road, I submit. I don't know. I submit that the vehicle had a flat tire. Did Karen Swift leave and go out on the Millsville Highway and the tire went flat, and then she came back on the way to the house and it was so flat you just couldn't make it anymore? The state would have you believe that this long journey, we talked about the cell phone towers, we talked about the network extender. I submit to you, Mr. David Williams did a very good example of explaining this in a way that we can understand. He's been doing this for a number of years. He's, I would submit, a national expert. His opinion about the time frame that they left, it doesn't agree with the time frame that they say about the committing the murder, loading a body up in her car, which there's no evidence in her car, going down to the cemetery, the Bledsoe Cemetery, almost 3 miles, parking the car, somebody that's injured. I'm not saying he's completely injured, but somebody that's injured, and a doctor said it, and physical therapy, and he eventually had to have surgery later, and then either pulling or grabbing her out of the back trunk or the passenger compartment, and he's, dragging the body. He set up a rough terrain, and then it would take a while. The person, if with his leg condition, it would take a while. And coming back and getting in the vehicle and then driving back, and the state would have you believe then coming to his own house and doing something to the tire, and then going back and parking the vehicle out there, and then walking back. This time frame just is not realistic. I don't know what happened. I know that we live in a world now that if a child's out playing in the yard and the parent goes into the house, that we don't know what could happen. We don't know what's lurking around, and things can happen. I can't explain it. The state has a theory and a suspicion. This theory and suspicion has to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. We decide cases by proof, speculation, not the autopsy. Well, could she have been strangled? The state asked, and suggesting it happened. And then I asked a medical examiner, is there any proof of strangulation? No. So if you say that she was strangled, wouldn't it, if you come to that conclusion, wouldn't you just be guessing? Yes. He said that. I asked him those questions. The blunt force trauma to the head, hard object. It would indicate a weapon. There was a hammer found out there at the cemetery. There's no indication that David Swift had anything to do with that hammer. I even subpoenaed the forensic scientists from the TBI to come in, the ones that they didn't bring in, to talk about what was done, like fingerprints and other things that either excluded David Swift. They also they mentioned Hog Shooter and took some examples from him. They didn't compare the fingerprints. They didn't compare any of the other the bonus. Their names are listed as a report as possibilities. They didn't test them. They just tested David Swift. They had tunnel vision and reasonable degree of medical certainty. How about a reasonable degree? That means you want to consider. And if there's 2 or 3 possible suspects and you're not sure, you want to at least do the testing to either eliminate or confirm. Nothing's been done that confirms that David Swift, through science, through any blood, DNA, fingerprints, fiber, and the prosecutor started his case out saying there is no proof scientifically or forensically, and so you have to consider all these things. Now, suspicion, or I don't like somebody, or a theory. They have a suspicion or a theory. As far as proof, it's beyond a reasonable doubt. The burden is on the state. Your mind has to rest easy as to these issues. The computer activity, and it seems like the state's case is like a shifting, whatever might work. Let's throw something out there and see if it sticks. There's no strangulation, let's suggest that. The tire, the nails, the screws in the tire at an angle. Somebody did that with a screwdriver. We had no proof or possibility or like screws found, and even their own experts said that. The computer stuff, you'll have to listen and see who you believed about, and the cell phone. I thought that Mr. Williams held up very good in his questioning with the prosecutor when prosecutor asked him and confronted about why he makes his opinions. And it's possible if you leave and there's no activity, there could be periods where it doesn't show on a tower. But you see the long video from the investigator with the DA's office. You see this big arc and map suggesting going down to Bledsoe Cemetery and then possibly other locations. It doesn't add up. Now, a few more things. How am I doing on time, Judge? All right. I'll try not to take it all. All right. Some of the witnesses, his neighbors, they didn't hear anything that night. They didn't see anything out of the ordinary that night. And so there's nothing to indicate a tire that is flat that is being driven is loud. The lady that lived on down the road that was in her barn that said she heard it. In her interview, it indicated that she lived like in a little bowl area. She thought it might come down I think what she says, to Harness Road. She wasn't sure. I asked her, did you look? Why would I look out the window at night? And then she later said, I looked out the door. She didn't see anything. She may have heard a noise. I asked her the question, did you call the police? And she said, probably. Or I usually call the police, but her interview was from several years later. I don't know. But the witnesses on the street didn't hear anything out of the ordinary. The passcodes and the user codes on her stuff, there's no proof that David knew those because she changed them. The Swift children, what they had to say, and in the days and years after this, how they've pulled together and he's raised them as a family. And they didn't see any signs of a disturbance in the house or around the house. The course of the investigation from 2011 until he was charged in 2022, a lot of things were done early on. After a while, less things got done. For whatever reason, a lot of things got stirred up by media or these people writing books and things of that nature. Sometimes when things are going on, there's pressure to do something, pressure. And pressure sometimes causes a reaction and choices to be made. We disagree with the choice to prosecute David Swift. He pleads not guilty to this. I don't know what happened, but there is no proof to support the state's theory in this case. You have heard all of my questions. You have heard all of the witnesses. The state said that this was a puzzle that they would put together for a complete picture. There is no complete picture. It's an incomplete picture, or there's things that are just not there. We ask you to find him not guilty of these charges. And I thank you for your time and attention.
Oh, okay. I thought I was shorter on time than that. Ladies and gentlemen, I will go quickly because I have a tendency to drag things out. There are three things that I submit to you that, at the end of the day, that are most important in your deliberations. One, ask yourself, did Karen Swift leave that house voluntarily? Given all of the evidence that we have, she'd been at work the whole day. She'd been at a party that night. She'd consumed alcohol. She was at her friend's, the Bonas, at around 1 o'clock in the morning, ready to go to bed when her daughter Ashley needed her. So, of course, she did what every good mom would do. She went and got her. She finally got home at 2:08 in the morning. It doesn't take, I mean, it's just common sense that she was exhausted. She wasn't going anywhere that night. She had no plans. And if you find that Karen Swift did not leave that house voluntarily, that leaves you with one inescapable conclusion, that David Swift killed her in that house. Mr. Taylor talks about the autopsy. What he really wants you to do is reward David for being so good at hiding her body. Over and over again to our suggestions, or to our questions, Dr. Ross stated, can't tell, too decomposed. Can't tell, too decomposed. Let's move on to the tire. If it occurred the way the defense would have you believe, that she was driving down Harness, ran over the tire, and then ran over the pebble, and then got the flat tire and stopped at Millsfield. What's the problem with that? You remember when I was questioning Mr. Darr, how long would it take for that tire to go flat? And he didn't want to answer because he knew the answer hurt his cause. He said, he agreed with me, 30 miles, 50 miles? Yes. How long does it take to drive 30, 50 miles? 30 minutes. So what's the obvious conclusion, ladies and gentlemen? That tire wasn't flat when it got to Millsfield Highway. So what's the obvious correlation with that? Karen Swift didn't have to stop. That tire was flat when it left 65 Willie Johnson Road. And lastly, the most important piece of the puzzle in this case, I submit, are the phones. It's common sense that whoever killed Karen smashed her iPhone. The iPhone ended up in the weeds with the Voyager phone. The Voyager phone called voicemail from the Swift home at 9:55 the next morning, 5 hours after the iPhone was destroyed. We know there was only one adult in the Swift home at 9:55 in the morning, and those two phones ended up side by side in the woods off Harness Road. David Swift killed Karen because he couldn't stand losing her. Hold him accountable for his actions and find him guilty.